On the morning of November 16, 1961, the crew of the Greek freighter Captain Theo spotted a white speck drifting in the northwest Providence Channel. It looked like debris, a piece of ocean trash, until it moved. As the massive ship pulled alongside, the sailors looked down into the abyss and saw something impossible. On a 2-by-5-foot cork float sat an 11-year-old girl in a thin white nightgown. Her skin was blistered to a deep mahogany by the sun. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon in a catatonic stare, and her body was so wasted by dehydration that she could no longer speak. She was alone in the middle of the Atlantic, miles from any known wreck. There were no lifeboats, no wreckage, and no other survivors. The girl was Terry Jo Duperrault. Her rescue would trigger a forensic investigation into what happened aboard the 60-foot ketch Bluebelle, uncovering a story so precise in its cruelty that it would change maritime law forever. But before the truth could surface, the world had to understand how this journey into paradise became a voyage into darkness. The trip began in Fort Lauderdale as the ultimate family escape. Dr. Arthur Duperrault, a successful optometrist from Wisconsin, had saved for years to take his wife, John, and their 3 children, Brian, Terry Jo, and Renee, on a week-long cruise through the Bahamas. To ensure their safety, Arthur hired Julian Harvey, a highly decorated former Air Force major and world-class sailor. Harvey brought along his new wife, Mary Dean. To the Duperraults, Harvey was the personification of competence, a silver-haired officer who moved with military precision and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had mastered the elements. The atmosphere on the Bluebelle for the first 4 days was textbook perfection. The family spent their hours snorkeling in turquoise shallows and exploring remote cays. On the evening of November the 12th, after a quiet dinner, Terry Jo retired to her small cabin at the back of the boat. The water was calm, the weather was clear, and the ship was anchored in the silent dark of the channel. Around 11 p.m., the silence was shattered. Terry Jo was awakened by the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps on the deck, directly above her head. Then came the screams. She heard her brother Brian shouting for their father, followed by a series of dull, rhythmic thuds that vibrated through the hull of the boat. Terrified, she stayed in her bunk for several minutes until the screams stopped and were replaced by an eerie, mechanical silence. When she finally gathered the courage to climb the stairs, she stepped into the main cabin and found her mother and brother lying in a pool of dark fluid. They weren't moving. Stunned, she looked up and saw the captain, Julian Harvey, emerging from the shadows. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't trying to help. He was holding a rifle. Without saying a word, he looked at the young girl, his face a mask of cold, unreadable intensity, and pointed back toward her cabin. Terry Jo retreated, shivering in the dark as the ship began to feel heavy. The floor beneath her feet started to tilt. A new sound filled the cabin, the gurgling of water rushing into the hold. Harvey had opened the seacocks, the valves designed to let water into the engine system, with the intention of scuttling the Bluebelle. He was sinking the ship to hide what had happened in the cabin. As the Atlantic rose to her waist, Terry Jo climbed back to the deck. The masts were groaning under the weight of the encroaching sea. She saw Harvey in the water, already sitting in the small dinghy. He had the body of her younger sister Renee floating beside him. He threw a rope to Terry Jo, telling her to hold the boat, but her hands were too weak. The line slipped. As Harvey dived into the water to retrieve the drifting dinghy, the Bluebelle took its final plunge. In the chaos of the sinking, a small cork float, a piece of emergency equipment, popped to the surface. Terry Jo grabbed it and climbed on, watching as the lights of the dinghy disappeared into the night. She was now a witness to a massacre, left to be erased by the ocean. Meanwhile, Julian Harvey's plan was moving with the same clinical precision he used in the military. The next day he was picked up by a tanker. He told the Coast Guard a harrowing, tragic story. He claimed a sudden squall had snapped the masts, starting a fire and sinking the boat. He told them he had tried to save the family, even pulling the youngest girl from the water, but she had died in his arms. His performance was flawless. He sat through hours of questioning with the weary, broken look of a hero who had failed. The authorities believed him. He was a victim, a grieving widower, and the only man who knew the truth about the Bluebelle. While Harvey was being comforted in a hotel, Terry Jo was entering her second day on the cork float. The physiology of her survival is a study in extreme endurance. Without fresh water, the human body begins to prioritize its organs within 24 hours. Under the relentless Bahamian sun, her skin began to peel in layers and her tongue swelled so much it blocked her throat. She began to experience the silent hallucinations of the deep, seeing phantom islands and hearing voices in the wind. Below the float, the environment was even more hostile. The Northwest Providence Channel is a highway for oceanic white-tip and tiger sharks. Terry Jo later recalled seeing the dark shapes circling beneath her, their fins occasionally brushing the underside of her tiny raft. She was a 2-by-5-foot island of life in a desert of salt water, surviving on nothing but the instinct to remain still. By the third day, the psychological isolation was as lethal as the physical heat. The Atlantic at night is a sensory vacuum. The stars provide the only sense of scale, and the silence is punctuated only by the rhythmic slap of water against cork. Terry Jo drifted through a state of semi-consciousness, her mind retreating into memories of the Wisconsin winter to combat the 100-degree heat. She was no longer a participant in her own survival. She had become a biological fixture of the sea. On the morning of November 16th, the freighter Captain Theo appeared on the horizon like a hallucination. When the crew pulled her onto the deck, they treated her with the delicacy of a shattered glass artifact. Her core temperature was dangerously low despite the heat, and her system was in a state of advanced shock. As she was airlifted to a hospital in Miami, the maritime world was already mourning the tragedy of the Bluebelle, based on Julian Harvey's testimony. The collision between Harvey's fiction and Terry Jo's reality occurred with surgical suddenness. Julian Harvey was staying at the Sandman Hotel in Miami, having just completed a second round of questioning with the Coast Guard. He was being hailed in the press as a tragic figure, the lone survivor of a freak accident. Then, a friend called his room with the news that had just broken on the radio. The 11-year-old girl had been found alive. The clinical precision that had defined Harvey's life was now redirected toward his exit. He didn't panic or attempt to flee. He behaved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a man who knew the mission had failed. He walked into the bathroom of his hotel room, closed the door, and used a double-edged razor to ensure that he would never have to face the witness from the deep. The subsequent investigation into Harvey's past revealed a pattern that the Bluebelle was meant to finalize. He had been involved in at least 6 previous suspicious accidents, including car crashes and boat sinkings, all of which resulted in insurance payouts. His wife, Mary Dean, was his latest intended payout. The Duperrault family had simply been collateral damage, witnesses to a murder for insurance scheme that Harvey had planned to bury under a mile of seawater. The case of the Bluebelle changed the way the Coast Guard approached maritime investigations and the psychology of survival. It remains a stark reminder of the limits of human cruelty and the staggering resilience of the human spirit. Julian Harvey had calculated every variable: the depth of the water, the speed of the sinking, and the probability of survival. He had accounted for everything except the 2-by-5-foot piece of cork and the silent, enduring will of an 11-year-old girl who refused to be erased. Terry Jo Duperrault did more than survive. She became the only voice for a family that a predator had tried to silence forever.